Gods and Diplomats on the relevance of the religious in diplomacy. And we have two primary guest speakers and two people who will be responding to their work. We're also marking the publication of two really interesting books this evening, one in English, one in French. But all conversation will take place primarily in English, but please feel free to ask any questions in French or to use some of the French terminology. If you feel like it, we'll be able to work between the two languages. So, this evening we are marking the publication by our new colleague, Dr. Sarah Wolf, of Secular Power, Europe and Islam, Identity and Foreign Policy, which is published by Michigan University Press this year. In this, Sarah really, I think, offers us a conceptual framework for thinking about the increasing role accorded to questions of religion within foreign policy, and particularly, I think, within EU foreign policy. I think the approach there is very much about kind of trying to understand a conceptual framework for thinking about this discourse that operates within the structures of foreign policy. And we have Delphine Alès with us, who is also bringing out, or has published a book this year too, which is called La part des dieux, the part or the piece, the part that belongs to the gods within religion. Okay, La part des dieux, religion et relations internationales, which was published by the CNRS Edition this year too. And Delphine is a professor at INALCO and a specialist of Southeast Asia. She's a professor of political science and is director of the Department of International Relations at INALCO, which is a language-based institution. So I find that interesting initially for the dissemination and teaching of languages, and in some respects what we are as an institution that started in languages and moved to international politics, and we seem to have in some way operated a similar sort of transition for a much larger institution of INALCO. So I think there's a lot that we share in that respect. And Delphine's book, as I have managed to acquire some small knowledge of, really looks at the fact that there's a much longer understanding that we need to have of the role of the gods within international relations. She has this really nice expression in the way this book is presented, which is to consider how comment les dieux ont toujours été mêlés aux affaires du monde, how they've always been kind of mixed up in the affairs of the world. So the way the evening is going to work is that we're going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk first for 15 minutes or so, and then to Delphine. So we will hear both of the two primary speakers talk about their work, and then I'm going to come back shortly in order to introduce the people who are going to be responding, one of whom is in the room with us and is Nadia Marzouki, and the other is going to be joining us online, François Forêt, who is going to be appearing on the screen. But I'll introduce them more fully in the little sort of pause between speakers. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to you, Sarah, to speak first. Actually, it was supposed to be Delphine first. Sorry, Delphine,
yes.
Sorry. I'm misreading this. Sorry.
I think because you have a wider...
A wider focus, sorry. My mistake in reading my notes here.
Sorry.
Delphine is up first. So, over to you, Delphine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I feel really humbled having to speak in English at the University of London, although we are in Paris tonight, so I hope that you will manage to follow despite my French accent, obviously. So it's really a great pleasure, and thank you again, Sarah, for taking the initiative and inviting me to present my book alongside yours. I think we really, as I was reading yours, found out that we are really in dialogue without knowing each other, so it's great that we get to present those books and discuss together tonight. So perhaps just a few words about the context during which I wrote this book. I wrote most of it in 2017, 2018, when I was posted in Yogyakarta in Indonesia with the CNRS, so it's a work in international relations, but it was really nurtured by the interactions that I was having on a daily basis with members of religious communities in Indonesia, with social activists involved in faith or interfaith related activities, and more broadly with a community of actors for whom religion existed obviously as a fact of life, sometimes as a label, sometimes as a strategy or as a concern, but not necessarily as a determinant of their daily lives and not necessarily as a determinant of their political choices. So in a way, I'll tell you perhaps more about this later, but in a way, being in this environment placed me in the situation of constantly having to check, having to see counterexamples to any of the global tendencies I was identifying as an internationalist, and it added a lot of complexity to the argument of the book, which I hope shows in the whole text. So it will be difficult, of course, to present all of that complexity in 15 minutes, but again, it's a book that is really rooted in those observations I got to make on a daily basis in Indonesia. So regarding the general organization of the next 14-15 minutes, I will talk about the main purpose of the book and the two concerns that underpin it, and then I will try to highlight three of the findings that I find most important to address. So the book and the broader research project it is based on pursues two main goals. The first one was to identify, let's say, the right place of religion in international relations. My point was really to try to trivialize the role of religion in international relations by integrating it into the analysis as a social factor, as an object or a target of public policies, but without over-interpreting the role played by the religious factor in international relations, and without forgetting that religion does not predetermine social behaviors. Perhaps I remove this, right? If you don't mind, it would be better, especially for me. Okay, so the point was not to overinterpret the role of religion in international relations and not to consider that it predetermines political or social behaviors. The second point, the second goal was to try to understand the determinants and the effects of the increasing integration of religion in common representations, common framings on global affairs. And as a result, its growing role, its growing integration at the core of many initiatives on the part of an increasing number of international actors, especially international organizations and NGOs. You've all heard about the countless interfaith dialogues, forums that are organized by international organizations. You've all heard about the necessity to engage with religious actors, which is increasingly pursued by NGOs and international organizations when they act, especially in non-Western environments. So that was the goal of the try to understand the effects of this increasing role and place of religion in framings. So the way I addressed this subject was largely conditioned by two concerns. The first one lies on the paradox. I've been researching various aspects of the place of religion in international relations and Indonesian foreign policies for 15 years. And for 15 years, I've kept reading that there is not enough research on the subject. And for 15 years, I've seen books pile up on the subject. There's a huge amount of literature, whether academic literature or think tank literature on the subject, and I found it just incredible, and I still find it incredible to read that basically half of the new books published on the subject start by saying that this is a new subject. Well, it's not actually. So it was my concern to try to address it a bit differently, but not to add to this myth according to which it's an understudied subject. The second concern, perhaps a bit more theoretical, is the fact that we live in an international system today which is characterized by its, let's say, universality. We live in a global, closed international system. We all live in the same international system, which is based on a Westphalian narrative. I think Sarah and I dialogue much around that. And that Westphalian narrative is perceived as secular, and at the same time, this framework it has globalized as it has been exported outside of Europe, and it has been gradually appropriated, transformed, hybridized by the new actors who have appropriated it. So it has been transformed in practice, although the narrative according to which the international system is secular is still prevalent. So I was really preoccupied with approaching this subject from a non-Western centric angle in order to try to grasp the effects of this hybridization on the role played by religion in world politics. Hence, the centrality of the Indonesian case in the book. So it's a book about international relations, but it's really based on that case. And I mobilized Indonesian case studies both as a matrix. There are a lot of arguments which I draw from observations I made in Indonesia and tried to broaden later. And I also used the Indonesian field as, let's say, a control and a place where I could check the validity of my arguments, where systematically trying to confront them with local dynamics. So moving on to the findings and what I've tried to say in the book. So again, I will stress on three arguments, but it's hard to summarize a whole book. The first argument I make, and I keep stressing that argument, is about the permanence of the religious factor in international relations, the fact that, well, I don't like the expression the return of religion because it has never left the international system. It has always been present, although in different forms. And so, along the lines of scholars like Talal Assad and many others, I question this Westphalian myth according to which secularization is a necessary condition for international peace. And I question the underlying idea that the so-called return of religion would necessarily be a vector of destabilization and conflict. So just to say a few words about the source of this representation according to which the international system, the Westphalian system, is secular, it's of course very much anchored in the origins of those famous treaties. Your students in international relations, so there's one date you know in world history, it's the date of the treaties of Westphalia, 1648, and they are conventionally seen as the basis, as you know, of the contemporary international system. So those treaties, as you know, have put an end to the so-called religious wars in Western Europe, and as such we often tend to simplify their historical impact by assuming that they have durably secularized the sphere of international relations until the recent combat that many would associate with the Iranian Revolution. In fact, what I insist on in the first part of the book is that those treaties did not secularize international relations. In a way, the Westphalian system is not Westphalian. It does not correspond to the norm we have built based on our interpretation of those treaties. Why? Well, because they did not kick religion out of politics. They just subjected it to the authority of politics. So they established a very strong hierarchy, at the top of which is the authority of the princes. The point of the treaties of Westphalia was, in fact, to facilitate the emancipation of the Western European princes from the supreme authority of mainly the Church, of the Pope. But it did not kick religion out of the political sphere. It just subsumed it to the authority of the politics. That's a first point. The second point is that even though religion was, in a way, subordinated to politics by the treaties of Westphalia, it never ceased to exist both as an autonomous force in societies, including in Western societies, and also it never ceased to be mobilized as a source of authority and legitimacy by political authorities themselves. Just observe, for instance, there are countless examples, but look at the role played by missionaries along colonial conquest. That's an example. Look closer to home, in the middle of the Cold War, which is usually pictured as the heightened moment of power politics based on secular ideologies on the one hand and material power confrontation on the other. Even in the middle of the Cold War, the United States mobilized the Christian identity of America in order to insist on the difference with the so-called ungodly Soviet Empire. Even the Soviet Union was mobilizing a co-opted Orthodox Church in order to contribute to the projection of the image of the Soviet Union as an empire of peace. So even the Soviet Union, again, which had a very strong anti-religious policy, was in fact mobilizing some religious actors in the middle of the Cold War. This observation is even more striking in other parts of the world, where the construction of the state has followed a trajectory which is very different from the Westphalian trajectories. If you look at many post-colonial societies, you have a trajectory which is in a way opposite to what I mentioned earlier in the context of Western Europe. In Western Europe, as I said, the point was to subsume religion to politics in order to emancipate from the supreme authority of the church. In the context of many post-colonial societies, and it's very much the case in Indonesia, religious actors, religious organizations, whether organized or not organized, I mean individual, religious motivated individuals, contributed to emancipation because they contributed to the opposition against the colonial powers. They contributed to form political organizations, some of which were religious-based, and this, of course, produced a context within which these religious actors legitimately claimed a place in politics after independence because they had contributed to the emancipation of the state. So in Western Europe, the state had to emancipate from the church in order to exist. In the case of Indonesia, but the same goes for the case for Egypt, the same goes for India, the same goes for Pakistan. You had a central role played by religious organizations alongside secular organizations, of course, in the emergence of the state itself. And of course, again, that explains the aspirations of religious actors to take part in political affairs in this context. Although in many cases that didn't work out. Those political actors were very soon relegated in many cases. It was the case in Indonesia, same went in Egypt, India, or they were relegated to the margins of the political system, partly because marginalizing religious actors was a way for secular nationalist leaders, first of all, to reinforce their own power, and secondly, it was also a way for them to get to acquire integration within an international system that they considered was based on a secular standard of civilization. So this secular standard of civilization was also a way of marginalizing religious leaders, and that contributed to further reinforce the idea that the global political system was mainly secular, and that in a way delayed the moment when religious actors came back in politics, mainly as contentious actors in this context, because they had been marginalized at a moment when they could have integrated politics. So the consequence of this very briefly summarized history is that the Westphalian lenses through which international relations were conceptualized that contributes to explain the difficulty for many internationalists who base their approach on the idea that the international system is based on the Westphalian, on an interpretation of the Westphalian Treaty which is secular, that contributes to explain the difficulty for us to address religion as an ordinary phenomenon in international affairs, and that explains that for a long time religion was either ignored or addressed as a mere instrument of power dynamics, as if it were just used by political leaders, or, that's another extreme, it was mainly approached as a turbulent factor. I use the term turbulence in world politics. I don't know if you know this reference from James Rosenow for international relations students. He's one of the first to have built a theory based on the role played by transnational actors, among which religious, among many others, but they were seen as essentially turbulent, not as ordinary actors that contribute to international relations. So that was my first point, the permanence of the presence of the religious factor and the fact that it hasn't been integrated within our Westphalian lenses. The second point I'd like to stress is the fact that more recently, there has been a transformation of the status granted to the religious factors in international relations in the sense that this factor has increasingly been addressed as an independent variable, as an explanatory variable in international relations. So things have evolved with the end of the Cold War, which weakened, of course, the hegemonic narrative according to which international relations were mainly guided by material power relations. But interestingly, the fact that the dominant narrative at the time was, let's say, cancelled, its validity was cancelled by the unexpected end of the Cold War, that did not put an end to the temptation of developing grand narratives to try to explain global affairs. And in a way, confessionalized narratives, next to others, but confessionalized narratives, mainly based on various declinations of the infamous clash of civilizations, they filled the gap. They replaced the previous grand narratives based on power politics. And several reasons explain why those narratives have filled the gaps. First of all, because if you explain world affairs by religious difference, it kind of maintains a unified framework which is very easy to transpose from one world issue to another. So it gives the impression that you adapt the narrative, but at the same time that you take into account the social variables that were previously neglected, etc. But at the same time, it's still a very broad and general approach. The second reason is the fact that confessionalized narratives, so narratives based on religious difference, in a way help to depoliticize the diagnostic you make on global issues. If you explain conflictuality by religious difference, you postulate like that there is, again, a rational explanation to conflictuality, and that will lead to relatively simple solution. If you have a simple cause, you will have simple solution. If the reason for world conflict or world conflicts is religious difference, then the solution is quite obvious. Organize interfaith dialogues and interfaith meetings, and you will quite easily solve those issues. Of course, it's not that simple, but you see how having a depoliticized narrative helps greatly to find and identify solution where getting more in depth into the complexity of societies would require, of course, more time, more investments, and much more difficult solutions to implement. So that explains, in a way, the ubiquity of these high-level interfaith, inter-religious or inter-civilizational, you name it, dialogues. That explains the reason why we've seen many initiatives since the late 1990s organized by several international organizations, and just give you a couple of examples. 2001 was chosen as the year of dialogue between civilizations in the United Nations. In 2005, you had the foundation of the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations against the clash of civilizations, etc., etc. So many attempts in a way to govern or to co-opt the religious factor in the hope of governing it and pacifying the conflicts that are attributed to religion. So what is new with this framework of analysis? It's really the fact that it sees religious factors as independent variables. So it sees religion as a cause which is self-explanatory in a way, which explains the tensions and the possible solutions to address them. So it's in this line, it's based on this analysis that religion has become an object of international politics, and it is given in a way an exceptional status, rather than being integrated as an ordinary variable, as a social factor which exists in societies, which is necessary to take into account in the understanding of societies and global issues. It is considered as something exceptional that needs to be addressed politically. So my third point is the performative effects and the self-fulfilling effects of this change of status of religion in world politics, and the fact that it has increasingly penetrated the analytical grids. It has increasingly been an object of policy initiatives of international public policies, attempting to govern religious diversity and inter-religious interactions. So why are there performative or self-fulfilling effects? Well, it is the case because these confessionalized framings inspire policies that tend to overemphasize the role of certain religious actors by contrast with others, and thereby they reinforce the legitimacy and the weight of certain religious actors. For instance, in large-scale interfaith dialogue, or in the calls for projects or for funding that are published by international organizations or NGOs, the religions that are mainly represented are most of the time broad, identified religious categories. If you want to have a seat at a table in interfaith dialogue, you better be a Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist. But if you're part of a small local religion that has no visibility, you will probably not get a seat at the table in a global interfaith dialogue. And inside these religious categories, especially for the religions which are not centralized, like Catholicism, you better represent one stream which is considered legitimate by the authorities that organize the interfaith dialogue. So that contributes to emphasize the role of certain actors within these religious categories over others which are marginalized. In that context, those actors who seek inclusion are also inclined, of course, to present themselves and to promote themselves as representative members of one of these visible categories. So that becomes defining elements of their own self, of their own identity, and that also tends to marginalize other parts of actors' identities. They tend to overemphasize their religious dimension rather than other elements. I have the example of one of the activists I was meeting very often in the field, who has become a friend. So she is, well, among many things, a Muslim woman. She is the head of several social work organizations, and she very openly says that she's a good client for international organizations as a Muslim woman who is the head of several social organizations. And she insists on that part of her identity because she knows that that will give her a seat at the table in several dialogues. So does it mean that she considers herself only as a Muslim woman? Of course not, but she also plays with that label because it helps her to advance other agendas that are important to her in terms of education, in terms of rights of women, etc. So the more actors, of course, brandish this part of their identities to conform to what is expected of them, the more visible the religious factor becomes and the more real it becomes on the field. So here is the self-fulfilling prophecy. These effects are extremely significant in conflict management or post-conflict resolution context, when the call for solutions is very often formulated in terms of, again, interfaith dialogue, interfaith meetings. It tends to overemphasize the religious dimension of conflicts, and it tends to marginalize the other dimensions which are also necessary, as we know, in post-conflict context. So that also tends to reinforce the religious dimension of the identity of the actors that are involved in those conflicts, and it can have detrimental effects because, as we know also, conflicts which are termed in or presented in religious terms, they tend to last longer than conflicts which are formulated in terms of economic claims or claims for recognition, etc. So that can have effects in the long term. At the same time, and I will finish with that, at the social level again, I also insist on the fact that all these processes, they are not automatic and they are not unilinear. So I'm not saying that there is a tendency which is unstoppable and that confessionalization is here to stay. What really being in the long term on the field has really led me to insist on is the fact that many local actors, and especially from the younger generation, they are perfectly conscious and they are perfectly reflective about the effects of those labels. They strategically reappropriate the religious identities that are thrown upon them, and there we have many examples of activists who try to reinvigorate local traditions precisely in order to criticize the effect of the global labels that are thrown upon them. That's, I think, where we are. So just to conclude, the point of the book, again, was to recall that it's wrong to say that the role played by gods was not significant and that it has come back. But at the same time, it's also important for me in this book to stress the limits and the consequences of an excessive confessionalization, both of our grids of understanding and of the policies that are implemented at the global level. Thank you. So, and sorry for the 5 extra minutes.
Thank you, Delphine, and I'm really glad that you went first because you have, I mean, your book is incredibly rich and it has this whole historical perspective on the role of the religious, and again, you drew on from so many case studies that, yeah, when I read it and I wrote it by chance actually, I was like, I should have read it before starting my own study, but we wrote about, you wrote in 2017, right?
Yes, and I had work to do, so I finished it last year, but...
Yes, so we roughly wrote at the same time, and but maybe from different perspectives. I also did some field work, but my field work was with diplomats themselves. So I had spent a lot of time already in Morocco, Tunisia, and North Africa to work on other issues of migration, I was interested in the role of religion, and then I got this Fulbright Schumann grant that enabled me to go to the US. And in the US, I really discovered how the religion had a completely different dimension in the relationship to politics and public affairs, and that even the State Department, I think at the time I was there, was still Hillary Clinton that was there, was actually consulting quite regularly faith-based actors, and they had a really privileged access. So I discovered another side of the role of the religious in diplomacy. But my own expertise has always been based in EU affairs, European integration, and foreign policy. And when I went to the US, I was actually interested in understanding why the EU was actually getting involved with what they called the so-called religious engagement. So that's developing and training their diplomats increasingly to have informal and formal contact with faith-based actors in different parts of the world. And we have François Forêt, who has also done some work on that and is following us, so he will comment on that. But this kind of disrupted a little bit my understanding of the EU and why was it getting involved with religious actors, and especially I started this book with, I think as EU study scholars, we always have this bias of referring to the concept of normative power Europe, which kind of depicts, and the EU has also capitalized on that, saying that it's a force for good and it promotes, norms around the world, and that the EU actually shapes conceptions of the normal. And what I argue in the book is that secularism is actually one of these norms, and it has, I'm not going to make the same argument that what I say is completely new and nothing has been written, but on the EU as such, I think, I hope that the study and the interviews that have been made are an innovative contribution, because I just discovered that secularism was one of the narrative from an official point of view, from a diplomatic point of view, that was mobilized by the EU when it engages with the religious. So possibly precisely contributing to just what you have described in terms of official global discourses on the religious, and kind of forgetting that religion is a normal fact, a normal aspect of social life in general. But on the other hand, we know that the EU is a very complex actor in foreign policy in general as well, but it has also very different understanding of what is secularism at home. So I would say we have different types of secularisms. And actually one of the argument, and at least in taking the example of Islam, of engaging with faith-based actors of Islam faith, that the EU is trying to fix its identity in international relation as a secular power. We can debate, but that was a little bit the objective. And then when I read your book, I was like, we come from the same perspective because we speak about decentering. And this is a new research agenda. I think some of my students have heard about it already. But it's also this idea that not only we recognize that there is some Eurocentrism to the way we understand the religious and the secular, and that there is a need to provincialize a little bit our assumptions, and Europe taking into consideration the work of Chakrabarty, for instance. And we have many colleagues in the field of EU foreign policy that have started a new work on how to decenter EU foreign policy. And this involves three main steps. So the first one is provincialization, referring to the question of deep-rooted Eurocentric narratives, which you do also very well in the book. But also engagement, that's the second step, with the perspective of the other. So if you speak about religious engagement, are you really engaging with the perspective of the others? What is the objective behind, from a diplomatic point of view, was my interest. And the third step is reconstruction. So that's I'm working now on a paper that should be published soon, I hope, which precisely say, well, after you have provincialized and you have engaged with the perspective of the other, it's about changing your external praxis on the basis of mutuality and local empowerment, which could be a constructive way to think about the way you suggest we should look at the religious. And these propositions have been made by a series of scholars, but I would just quote Nora Fischer-Renard, Calypso Nicolaides, and Stéphane Kekeler and Sharon Lecoq, who have done a lot of work on that. So it's a new agenda, but I saw that it was present also in your book, and I felt, okay, we're talking the same language and we can have a double book club. But of course, if I would like to have a real, and it's a very ambitious agenda, and unfortunately I think in the book I just managed to do, the first, maybe a little bit the second step, but not fully, because it requires also tough and stringent methodology as well if you want to decenter. Yes, so the book, I will still maintain it, I think, is one of the contributions on EU foreign policy that looks at the role of the religious and secularism, which had been, except for a few exceptions, amongst which François has contributed, was not really research in the field of European foreign policy. We tend to focus on comparative European studies to look at the differences of state-religion relationship in different countries. We have little knowledge of the role that secularism and religion play in EU foreign policy. We might know a little bit about French foreign policy or Danish foreign policy when there are crises and so on, but not necessarily the whole picture of the EU. And actually, maybe validly so, because at first sight, the EU has no competence when it comes to the religious, right? I will come back to that. It's actually interested in having this dialogue of the religious from a political point of view, I think. I also look at secularism more, so we could have a very functional definition of what secularism is, the separation, as you were saying, from the Westphalian system, separation of public affairs, state affairs, and the religious. But in fact, what I try to show in the book is that secularism is actually a narrative, and it is also highly politicized within the European Union. There has, especially if you look at debates in the European Parliament as well, there is politicization, and it is one of the elements that helps the EU to build a self-biography. So I take a more identity-based and more constructivist approach as well to the identity of the EU as an actor of international relations. It conditions how the EU narrates the story of itself, of the significant other, so in that case it's Islam, but religion in general, and the rest of the world. It's a dynamic concept, it is being contested, and it's not set in stone, but what I argue is that it is part of the EU's collective identity, even though it means different things to different people in the European political community. And we have this debate, and I think Nadia, who is here, also has contributed importantly with another colleague of hers, Elizabeth Chapman-Hurd, who has done also, I think, very, has delivered leading work on this. But that secularism is subject to politicization with dynamics of contestation and negotiation, and for some secularism might mean freedom, for others it's actually associated to a Judeo-Christian identity. Yeah? In the book, in terms of theoretical contribution, I draw from the work of Anthony Giddens, who came up with the concept of ontological security. So it's also trying to understand the EU a little bit differently, but thinking about the self and the other, and that the self, the EU, it can also be reflective, and that it builds this cohesive narrative as a secular Europe, or secular power Europe, we can discuss, to provide trust and confidence in itself, what kind of international relation actor it is. And we have this constant debate about the liminality status of the EU in international relations. So it provides the EU to some extent with a sense of order and continuity about its role in international relations. And this continuity happens, so in the book I use different methodologies, but I look at narratives, but I also look at practices and how routines also help to establish this sense of continuity for an actor such as the European Union, and therefore why the EU would be interested to also establish trainings, for instance, for its diplomats, and to create a sense of continuity. Yeah, and most of the work, so as I said, has been made with, so I had some field work in Tunisia, in Morocco, but mostly it was Washington, Brussels, Paris, London, so, and in Brussels I focused a lot on the External Action Service. I think overall it was based on 80 interviews, and it was quite interesting because I had, like you did with activists, I sat with diplomats, and for most of them, they didn't see themselves as having been trained to actually deal with the religious. For them, they actually really fit this Westphalian kind of myth, some of them, depending on the generation maybe, but diplomacy is not trained to deal with the religious, it's not their job. And then I had others, a smaller minority, who were really interested in really having a genuine religious engagement, to work on issues such as blasphemy, such as freedom of religion or belief, and that were way more active and wanted to go exactly beyond what you have described as global interfaith dialogue that I think we could say have been a failure, more or less, or have failed for most of them, or have perpetrated an idea of what precisely we didn't want to perpetrate with Huntington, Clash of Civilization. So that was very, very interesting. And I must also highlight that, so originally the EU has no competence to deal with the religious, but in the 80s there was Jacques Delors, and Jacques Delors was actually willing to give a soul to Europe. And I think he had a Christian democratic kind of background as well, and he initiated a high-level dialogue between with religious leaders in Europe. So he started informally these kind of high-level meetings that we have seen at the global level, but to kind of also include these religious actors to promote a pluralist views of voices about public policies in Europe, especially on moral issues. So they have been consulted as well. And now it has been integrated in the Treaty of Lisbon, so there is an Article 17 of the treaty where these leaders meet. Maybe François can tell us more about the effectiveness and to what extent they manage to change or to influence. But it's quite interesting to think about who has the right to sit around the table. And I've had several conversations with people organizing these meetings. So how do you identify, the person representing that religion and so on? And actually, there are many factors coming into the picture, but it's mostly by network. And as you said, some actors are strategic and label themselves as the best representative of the Muslim or the Buddhist community in Europe and will get a seat because they're networking and because of socialization, but doesn't mean that they are representative. Yeah. And just to give you an idea of the language as well that the EU used, because I use this self-biography and this narrative, I have a few quotes here of high-level EU officials. So this was actually quite a long time ago, 2003, when Javier Solana was the High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security. And he was actually trying to define a little bit the EU versus the US in terms of religious versus secular terms, so precisely what you were saying. And he says, well, it's a kind of a binary model. It is all or nothing. For us Europeans, it is difficult to deal with because we are secular. We do not see the world in such black and white terms. That's the official language, but actually in the practice, sometimes it's not what was happening. And therefore, you can clearly see how secularism also shapes EU foreign policy and practices towards Islam. It is also importantly socially constructed as well, I would say, within EU foreign policy and what kind of meaning people give it to it, but also the development of a certain secular habitus, I would say, borrowing from Bourdieu, in terms amongst EU institutions and EU diplomats. Another example is more recent, is the High Representative Federica Mogherini. She was commenting on post-conflict Syria and what her wishes for the country would be. And she said, well, it has to be united, not divided, secular, inclusive, and with space for all minority groups. But again, what does the EU mean when it wishes and promotes secularism to abroad and to other countries? We have different traditions, and I think overall my findings are that the EU behaves a little bit like a state, a nation state, in a Westphalian way. A majority, of course, as I said, the EU is always about politicization and debate and contestation, and there are different tensions, and some actors are more innovative and would like to have, you have, for instance, this case study I mentioned, the Global Exchange on Religion in Society, which was an initiative of actually Federica Mogherini to involve civil society in consultations, faith-based civil society in consultation over EU foreign policy, which I found quite innovative. At the moment, I think the project, unfortunately, is not going moving forward that much. But that was just to give you an idea. So in the book, I have three main case studies that I look at. So the first one is actually looking at how the EU has built its secular power in a way that it wants to control or to moderate Islam, especially through various ways, and one of which has been to actually support all these inter-religious, interfaith dialogues, the civilizational politics, which provide a shared organizing frame for the EU to moderate religion and Islam. But also there has been a sort of outsourcing of the EU to its southern Mediterranean neighbors, especially to restructure Islam through socialization of the inter-religious dialogue, and it has had it has been supporting also the development of the Islam du juste milieu, a moderate approach to Islam, with two countries especially. I focus on Jordan and Morocco, which also are key to EU's physical security in terms of counterterrorism and providing stability to the EU. But the EU has supported the Amman messages, which were going with funding as well, which were going in the same direction of supporting the sort of peaceful Islam. And then with Morocco, which is known as well, it's a strategic partner, but it promotes also these Maliki rites and Sufism, which is interesting because I think if we take a historical perspective, Sufism was considered as heretic by Europeans like a century ago. Now we think that it is the type and the kind of peaceful Islam that we would like to see. So that's very interesting. And of course, there are lots of, this is mobilized strategically by a country like Morocco that wants to be seen on the global scene as a country that is involved in counterterrorism forums. So it co-chairs, for instance, it has been co-chairing with the Netherlands for a very long time global counterterrorism forum, but it has also been very active in promoting the training of imams, including European African imams in the new Mohammed VI Institute for the Trainings of Imams. So that also supports these countries. And then this logo, Religion and Diplomacy, is another venue that I have researched, which is called the TPRND, the Transatlantic Policy Research Network on Diplomacy, that basically looks at the role of the religion and diplomacy and amongst a community of, amongst a group of like-minded community of partners, so where there is a lot of exchange on best practices from a diplomatic point of view. And that helps also socialization around this secular identity of the EU. The EU has also been developing trainings and gaining expertise on religion, so it's this labeling of becoming religiously literate as well is quite popular within the European External Action Service, but also other European diplomatic services all have this dimension. Freedom of religion or belief, here you have the logo of the European Parliament intergroup that has been working on it. The European Union has also developed lots of initiatives. It has adopted foreign policy guidelines in 2013, instructing EU delegations on how to deal with freedom of religion or belief. It has created high-level dialogues. It has integrated it into its funding. So it has become, there has been a special envoy who was Jan Figel, and now I think there has been some controversy on his role as well, in the sense that he was closer to supporting or to going and support Christian minorities abroad than actually having an inclusive perspective on freedom of religion or belief. And basically you see that there has been a lot of activism on the EU to work on freedom of religion or belief, even though we have also existing legal instruments that are already, from a human rights perspective, guaranteeing this right. But all these instruments are, again, I think, being mobilized differently by different actors within the EU. So the EES, I would say, has a very human rights type of approach, whereas if you think about the European Parliament, it becomes instantly politicized, and it's in some of the most conservative parties, it has been to promote a Christian identity and to support Christian groups abroad. And I have mentioned this, I think, innovative experience of the global exchange on religion in society, but unfortunately I'm not sure that at the moment the EU is and the new High Representative Josep Borrell is willing to pursue it. So I think overall, what is the book doing? It is really making the argument that throughout all these initiatives, the EU is constructing, like a state, I think, a nation state in a way, has this secular vision of religion in IR. It has the ambition to contain or to govern religion in foreign policy, and it's a survival strategy to promote, to have some continuity in its secular, liberal model. This ontological security of the EU is in fact permanently contested, and we have to look at discursive configurations abroad, globally and domestically, and we have to contextualize it in a social and historically meaningful order, which in the case of Europe is framed by secularism. So in the end, as a conclusion, what I have seen, and it depends on different actors, is that sometimes the EU engage selectively with some religious actors, which could provide more insecurities and polarization in the region, at least, and vis-a-vis Islam. And it sometimes tends to reproduce, unfortunately, hegemonic and Eurocentric modes of engagement when it deals with the religious and the secular. So I hope I kept it on time.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Speak to one another over both in terms of their temporal anchoring, but also with some quite different concepts. I really think it's going to be important that we have a debate with the room. So I'm going to invite the next two speakers, Nadia Marzouki first, to come up and respond primarily to Delphine's work, but to kind of open up some avenues of reflection that I'm hoping that François, speaking from Brussels, will then pick up on, and will be responding more particularly to Sarah's work. So I'm going to put you onto the screen in a minute, François, but I'll do that in just a second, because I think sort of sitting being watched is probably not a particularly pleasant experience. So let me just introduce Nadia and François together, and then hand over to Nadia. So Nadia is a chargée de recherche, a tenured research fellow at the CNRS, the National Research Institute in France, and she's also a member of the Sciences Po-based network in international relations. She works particularly around public controversies relating to Islam in the United States, and she's the author of a book called Islam, an American Religion, which was published in 2017 by Columbia University Press. François is Professor of Political Science at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He is a researcher in the Center for the Study of Political Life, and he's an expert in European studies, and his interests are particularly focused on questions of European integration, collective values, identity and memory, and the relation between religion and politics. So, two quite different, again, places and approaches to a very central and pervasive aspect of our lives. So, Nadia, over to you. And yeah, please, I've kept my mask on this time, but please feel free to remove your mask as you're speaking.
Thank you so much for this invitation. It's fantastic to have this opportunity to discuss these books together. Thanks for being here. So, Delphine, thank you so much for this book. I read it quickly but thoroughly, and I found this is a fantastic book, much needed book in France also, in the French context. In French academia, you're, I think, one of the first scholars really bringing in this sort of Assadian critique of the secularist understanding of religion in IR in the French scholarship in IR, if I'm not mistaken. So I think this is quite important to underline just this, given the complexity of debates around religion and secularism. I don't know if you guys were around last spring during the nice debates we had around Islamo-Gauchism and academic freedom, but this is the kind of atmosphere that we scholars of religion are working with when we're writing about these topics. So I think having this scholarly contribution that set the record straight around these issues is supremely important, and even more so in the French context. I found this is a formidably well-written book, extremely sophisticated, nuanced, astute, sobering, that brings together a historical understanding of how the Westphalian state misconstrued its relationship to religion, based also on an amazing sociological ethnography of actors in Indonesia, that I think the way you move from different local scales to national to international and transnational scales is absolutely, it's done in a masterful way, and it's extremely impressive to the way you bring in all these skills together without ever being awkward or contradictory. So I really want to underline all these contributions. So I'm not going to repeat the main arguments of the book. I really encourage you to read it, but I want to underline what I thought were major contributions of this book, and then maybe ask you a few questions just to open up the discussion. I think I really want to go back to the position you take in this book. You mentioned it again in your introduction, but I think it's really an important contribution in this debate about religion and IR. You mentioned Elizabeth Sheckman-Hurd and all these trend of scholarship, but I think you move the conversation further because your starting point is that you want to critique the assumption of secularization after Westphalia, okay? You want to critique the assumption of a return of religion in IR, okay? But then based on this, people go in different directions. And I think the sort of Assadian trend goes very far in the sort of maybe idealization of religion as a space of critique. And you have a more modest, I think your term, and you say methodologically more prudent, I think you use this term, ambition, which is to decenter religious phenomenon, and you say they don't have necessarily in and of itself a transgressive force, because if you approach them as that site of transgression and critique, in doing so you do reinforce the assumption that secularism is the norm. And I thought that was extremely powerful. So I think that position and your what you call your prudence, I find is actually very, very important and innovative. In terms of your arguments, your takeaways related to your arguments, which is an analysis of this instrumental use of religion by states, international NGOs, IOs, and how this instrumentalization naturalizes and essentializes religion, and in doing so obfuscates other factors and other types of actors. And you do that very well by showing the negative impact of this essentialization process in terms of impoverishing the complexity of modes of interaction, conflict resolution. And this is where I think your expertise as both a sort of historian and sociologist and an IR scholar is extremely helpful, because you move from that type of argument to giving immediately an example that I find fascinating. For example, when you mentioned how in Indonesia communities of Christians and Muslims had this tradition of dealing with one another and building pacts without thinking of these pacts within the framework of inter-religious dialogue. They just figured out pacts and contracts. But once the language of inter-religious dialogue is imposed with that history you described, it sort of impoverishes and even sort of weakens that type of pact's ability to deal with one another. So I think this is extremely well demonstrated. But even more powerful is that you don't stop there, and you do show how these trends of essentialization of religion by the new IR dynamics, that's not the whole story, and that there are also, and you insist on how actors at the local level are able to appropriate and play and seize these new norms and transform them sometimes to their advantage and play with them. So I think that ability to proceed with a sort of dialectical analysis throughout the book is extremely precious. And I really want to commend at the subtlety and the subtleness of your analysis at every step of the way. For example, something that you mentioned in your presentation, that observation you had at the beginning of your work. Well, everyone, every single book, every single scholar of these topics says, well, it's new, and yet it's not that new anymore, this discussion. And so, but the impact of this observation is very important, and that's what comes from your book. What's ironic is that immense effect of creating all this inter-religious dialogue organization, all these standardization processes and power dynamics are actually the effect of something that's not even stabilized in the first place. So that also raises some question of like, and going back to my comment about, I think, the strength of your positionality towards the sort of Assadian literature and what you bring that's innovative is that where they tend to see something like an intent, a coherent project of imperialism, liberalism that's there to sort of discipline others and other subjectivities, mostly Muslim world, if I understood correctly, your approach is a little more astute because you're like, yes and no, because it's not a coherent project, it's something that's not even stabilized. And if you allow me, because you couldn't quote yourself, that would be awkward, so I'm here to do that. I want to quote this in French, that when you say, you talk about the banalisation de cette tendance à la confessionnalisation, you say, I quote, alors qu'elle s'est généralisée depuis les années 2000, cette préoccupation reste quasi systématiquement abordée dans le registre de l'injonction à innover. And I think this is really interesting because it's just something programmatic and yet that produces such strong consequences. A last comment also that I think to speak about the strengths of this book is its scope, its generalizability of your argument, right? You mentioned mostly the third part is about Indonesia, but what I find fascinating is that a lot of, and I'm not an expert at all on Indonesia, but what you describe about the dynamic between national Islam and transnational Islam, and how actors position themselves vis-a-vis these two frameworks, this is something I could have more or less term by term transposed to my understanding of Tunisia. Like national Islam as the good Islam, this idea of the myth of Tunisianité, and as something pluralistic and moderate, etc., versus transnational Salafi Saudi Islam that's there. So it's really interesting because it means that what's at play, and this is what you suggest in the first two parts of the book, is something that's about the power of states more than just a story of secular versus religion. It's really ultimately a story of how nation states govern, where you put the divide between religion and secular, and what counts as acceptable religiosity. So I think this is also an important contribution of this book. So thank you. And now moving on to questions, and feel free to answer just one of them. It's really just food for thought, and they may be completely irrelevant to where you want to bring this project next. But I want to maybe push you on one sort of more the normative assumption of behind this project, and to the sort of policy implications of this project. So in your presentation and in the book, I understood that you have this sort of assumption that there's a distortion at play of religion through essentialization processes, whereby religion should be studied as, or approached as, something that's more ordinary. So could you unpack this understanding, this sort of what would be a normative alternative in terms of the framework? Is is it something like along the lines of what Cécile Laborde or Balibar, when he talks about secularism, sort of advocates, which is let's disaggregate religion. Let's just do away with this category and let's just look at a series of practices and let's stop labeling them as religion, and because then it's just all this question of what counts as religion, and that would be so basically, is your normative assumption that secularization is good but unachieved, and we should just go full secular, and that right now the problem is that we're not. We say we're secularized, but we're not really. Or is your sort of normative standpoint something that's more like a sort of a critical take, a more Assadian critical take, which is, well, ultimately, secularism is this project of disciplining practices and subjectivities, and we're never going to be never going to be able to do away with that project. And second question about the sort of policy implication, what would an alternative be when you say, when you ask the question at the beginning of the book of how could political structures better integrate diversity, the diversity of these mobilizations? So how could they do that? Again, and it's related to your normative assumptions. Would it be to just do away with religion, or propose different categorizations? What do you think are possible sort of perspectives to think about these next steps practically? How many minutes do I have? I'll wrap up. Yeah. So just one last maybe comment, I think, more than a question. I think the book does a fantastic job describing the pitfalls of this logic of recognition in which local actors are trapped, right? When you say they have to sort of play by the rules of this discourse of religious interfaith and interreligious dialogue. And I was thinking, reading your book, of another book by Javier Itzaina, who's a political scientist at Sciences Po Bordeaux. The book is Catholic Mutations in Southern Europe, Invisible Mobilization of Religion. And it sort of tells the story that's complementary to yours, in the sense that he looks at actors that are related to some religious organizations but do not want to be labeled as religion, and are not interested in a politics of recognition but are interested in work of mediation. And I think it would, maybe for another book launch, it would be really interesting to have the two of you talk together, because you're looking at this sort of a set of, for him it's Southern Europe, for you it's mostly Indonesia, but ultimately the questions are similar, but looking at local actors interested in different types of politics, I think that could be very fun to have this kind of discussion. So yeah, just a few ideas, but thank you so much for this book.
Thank you, Nadia.
I hope that you can hear me, and I regret not to be with you today, but at least the Corona had the advantage to naturalize the hybrid option. It's of course not the same thing, but it's better than nothing, and besides, you don't have to wear a mask when you face your screen alone, so it's for the It's really a pleasure to have this discussion on the very good books with distinguished colleagues. And it's especially interesting to address two reflections quoted both in IR and in regional expertise. It was already highlighted, but both Sarah and Delphine know very well the area used as a fieldwork, and it makes a world of difference to avoid some general considerations from a bird's eye view that are so common in IR. And it's also very interesting to discuss these books from the standpoint of more internal perspectives, as probably Nadia and myself may do. So many of my reactions will be commanded also by this positioning as an internationalist. No, sorry, as an internalist. I bow to the superior knowledge of Nadia regarding Islam, so I will not come back to this topic. I am not totally foreign to the transatlantic dimension, but I may insist a bit more on the European dimension proper, on the specificity of the European Union as a policy machine, as a polity and as a political space. And I will also focus more on Sarah's book, but occasionally bridge the discussion towards First of all, and I have to start with a regret, sorry, but I don't have bad things to say about the book by Sarah, because it's just a brilliant volume, and I agree with most of it, so I don't have any ready-made intellectual controversy in store. I know it's a pity, but it's like that. Secular power Europe and Islam is conceptually sophisticated. It's empirically very well informed, and it's also well written. And of course, it does not come as a surprise for me, knowing the expertise of Sarah on these topics, and knowing also her ability to connect the academic reflection and the policy dimension, and it's also very very important. Still, beyond this due congratulation, it's possible to have a discussion, and I do have some remarks and questions. I think the first quality of Sarah's book, and it's also true for Delphine's book, is the ambition to look at the broader picture and to define Europe as a whole, as a polity, without taking shelter in a narrow niche-based analysis, as you can find so often in European studies and in IR. Because indeed, when you deal with religion, you deal with the normative resources that are the bedrock of political orders and communities throughout history. Like it or not, in Weberian terms, politics and religion are the two universal perspectives that compete or that combine also to establish the legitimacy of this politics and to shape the relations with other human groups. Secularization blurs this picture, but it does not delay it. So this broad picture is necessary. It's sometimes discredited by oversimplifying views, Huntington style clash of civilizations, for example, but it does not mean that it should be deserted. So the book does that very well, and it emphasizes that discussing the relevance of religious diplomacy means much more than discussing the box of diplomats and the training organized by the European External Action Service. So just to say that we are really dealing with a central issue. Sarah defines the European Union as secular, and this statement is fundamental. It's not to be taken for granted. For example, in the contemporary scientific debate, you have other conceptual proposals that may challenge this view. I have in mind, for example, the recent book by Carlo Invernizzi Accetti, framing the European Union as a Christian democratic creation. So here we have the important. And it's not only a matter for intellectual speculation. Political discourse, like the claim by Orban to be the true inheritor of Christian democracy, the defender of European Christian civilization, is also an illustration of the political and policy salience of it. And actually, Orban and its like demonstrate the secular character of Europe, because they mobilize religion as an instrumental resource serving political purposes. In the same way, ongoing debates regarding the future of Christian democracy in the post-Merkel Europe may have even implications for the future of European governance. So this is very necessary to connect the external and the internal dimension. And I think that this example also confirms the accuracy of Sarah's bridge between religion, the uncertainty of European identity, and the search for ontological security. So I totally agree on this basic orientation, and I may even be a bit more radical than Sarah when she writes, for example, that secularism is not safe. For sure, secularism means different things to different people in the European political community. To say that the European Union is secular does not mean that it is secularist. It's still very possible to advocate views inspired by religious values. But secularism is the only legitimate repertoire if you want to produce effects, to claim a political agency. So religiously inspired actors, be it politicians, lobbies, or intellectuals, have to use this repertoire and rights, universal moral principles, if they want really to have any influence. Is it that bad? Is it necessary to go for a post-secular option? And this is an underlying question that sometimes to pop up in the book. And just again to jump to the conclusion, to be a post-secular power, Europe must acknowledge that the future of human security, democratization and rule of law does not necessarily need to be anti-religious. But is it really that anti-religious? So to which extent is it necessary to be a post-secular power? What does it mean? Again, I think that there is no real divergence on this, but maybe it's also a basis for further reflection and action. Sarah already gives an answer to this question. She advocates the necessity to decenter the gaze and to go beyond the propensity of the European Union to consider religion as foreign. So, yeah, sure, it's a necessity to exit from the Eurocentric view of world history and to provincialize Europe, to acknowledge other paths of modernity. I quote again, this is of course intellectually and politically necessary. Meanwhile, in sociological terms, it is also necessary to acknowledge that religion is more and more foreign. Secularization is a deep and growing reality, and this is not about to change. Just an example, a very common example, the comeback of religion to the fore under traumatic forms does not alter this. When you analyze radicalization and especially counter-radicalization policies, both at national and supranational level, you see how discourses and practices have converged to evacuate this religious dimension. The progressive dilution of the religious reference is obvious throughout the years, whether you consider parliamentary deliberations, expert deliberations, and political debates. Besides, and especially not only at the supranational level, another thing that you see is a trend towards the externalization of this. And here I have a question also, to say that the European External Action Service become more and more prominent on the religious issue, more and more active. Okay, that might be a sign that religion is taken more and more seriously globally. But it may also be a sign that it's just an outcome of the externalization of this issue. Better the European External Action Service than the Commission or than other bodies that have to deal with religion in internal. So, in other words, this externalization of the problem, is it not maybe a qualification of the acknowledgement of religion as a diplomatic issue? I have more petty questions to finish regarding the interpretations of both Delphine and Sarah about the most recent developments in global affairs. The provincialization of Europe is de facto achieved. There is a stronger and stronger evidence that the European Union as a whole and European countries in their individual capacities are secondary players on the world stage. The confrontation between China and the US, but also regarding the rise of other powers and regional dynamics. By the way, regional dynamics are not totally maybe taken into account, for example, in the book of Delphine, so it could also be an interesting point to bridge the two books, come back to this point. So subsequently, the self-vision and the cultural relativism of Europeans in their way to address religion risk not only to be more and more wrong, but simply irrelevant and insignificant, because less and less people care about the European way. So in this context of global European decline or withdrawal, whatever you name it, religion is still a very minor issue on the diplomatic table. So when the questions are that big, you think that really is it likely to see religion emerging in this context where many other more pressing issues are already very demanding? And the last question, this transatlantic dimension, is maybe about the concern to know to which extent Europe may still consider the US or other Western partners are like-minded regarding the evolution of frameworks for cooperation and the willingness to engage with each other to deal with the religious dimension in global affairs.